What makes 1986 so special that many comic book enthusiasts think it's the greatest year of all time? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at what came out in 1986 and how it really redefined the comic book landscape. The beginning of 1986 saw Crisis on the Infinite Earths come to an end, with the final issue in March. Crisis was a 12-issue limited series that would have a huge impact on the DC universe and completely reshape the landscape of all the characters. This was an attempt to simplify the DC universe from the complex multiverse it had become over the years, from DC acquiring all these properties from other companies, as well as separating its heroes from previous eras. It was really quite an event, rewriting the history of the DC universe along with some notable deaths of some major characters, including Supergirl and The Flash. Now, we all know that I use the term death very loosely here because no character really truly dies in comic books. They're just tucked away and brought back in the future in one form or another. DC essentially rebooted their entire universe with Crisis and started again fresh with new takes on their major characters. Their big three characters, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, got retooled in different ways. The most dramatic would be Superman, with John Byrne's completely new re-imaging in the 6-issue series The Man of Steel. Superman's history would be given a complete makeover, from his Kryptonian origin to his classic villains like Lex Luthor. It would have a lasting impact, and despite some criticisms towards the makeover, it breathed new life into Superman and created a lot of interest in his titles. This kind of makeover on a character that has a long and rich history is difficult to pull off without, upsetting readers who are familiar with the character's history, but it's safe to say that Superman and his titles were getting pretty stagnant at this time, and a reboot was really needed. Early in 1986, we saw Frank Miller's Dark Knight, a 4-issue miniseries that forever changed Batman. This was a gritty, violent, and spectacular series, considered one of the greatest series of all time. The complete package was something else, from the square-bound deluxe format to the brilliant artwork done by Miller, Jansen, and Varley. This really was a breakthrough series in many ways. From the story to the presentation, it felt like the comic book medium had really matured to a new level. Frank Miller would also write one of the greatest Daredevil stories of all time that year, and that's Born Again, with great artwork by David Mazzucchelli. Miller was well known for his run in Daredevil in the early 1980s, a run that lasted over 30 issues, where he introduced new characters and reintroduced some classic characters to the Daredevil series. Born Again would follow in the same vein of his work on Dark Knight. These are not the same comic books you grew up with, and I remember how much of a shock this series was to me when I first read it. It was really quite the year for Frank Miller. Dark Knight and Watchmen really redefined the comic book medium, and it kind of set a darker, more grittier tone after they were published. Some feel that this darker, negative tone, might have had a negative effect on how comic books were produced afterwards, but there's no doubt that these two series were highly entertaining. 1986 really felt like a year where writers started to come to the forefront, with Frank Miller and Alan Moore. And, Frank Miller with Born Again and Dark Knight, and you had Alan Moore with Watchmen. But Alan Moore did just an insane amount of quality work during this year. Not only did he have Watchmen, but he also had his run on Swamp Thing. He had the Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, 2-issue, wonderful story. And as well, he also had Miracle Man. Miracle Man was released in 1985, but with number 6 that was published in 1986, Alan Moore started new stories, because before they were reprints of Marvel Man from Warrior magazine. A phenomenal body of work in 1 year. While the 1970s saw a steady decline in terms of comic book sales and readers, the 1980s actually saw a pretty steady uptick until towards the end of the decade, where we actually saw an explosive growth in terms of how many comic books were being published. Marvel ran a huge crossover storyline called The Mutant Massacre, with their popular mutant titles X-Men, X-Factor, and The New Mutants. The crossover would spill over to many titles like Daredevil and Thor. In 1986, the Punisher limited series, written by Stephen Grant and drawn by Mike Zeck, would launch the Punisher into the stratosphere in terms of popularity. The 1980s were a time where you had cycles of boom and bust for independent publishers. But one publisher in particular would have legs that would last until present day, and they are aptly named Dark Horse. There were also a lot of copycat independent publishers looking to copy the success of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which came out just 2 years before. Many of them weren't very good and wouldn't last more than a year. This was the mini black and white independent explosion era where comic book stores would be glutted by these small press publishers, and many collectors were jumping on the speculator bandwagon, hoping they would score the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but like many speculator bubbles, they just got stuck with a lot of junk. So this is going to be a bit of a speed round showing a number of different books from 1986 in my collection that I thought are also worth mentioning. And I'm also going to be talking about some of the books that I've mentioned as well. And these are Crisis on the Infinite Earths, number 10 and number 12. Number 12 is the last issue. This was certainly a big deal when it came out. It kind of cleaned up the DC universe and involved pretty much anybody and everyone in the DC universe at that time. Alan Moore was still kind of at his peak writing Swamp Thing, and issue number 53 is actually one of my favorite issues where Batman and Swamp Thing face off. But in particular as well too, there's a couple of pages featuring Lex Luthor that Alan Moore does an amazing job just kind of demonstrating how smart Luthor is. But it's a giant-sized double issue where Swamp Thing basically takes on an entire city to save Abigail. But one of my favorite issues of Swamp Thing and very memorable. At the end of the year, Batman 400 came out, and this was an anniversary issue with a great Sienkiewicz cover. And look at the lineup of artists who contributed to this anniversary issue. It's pretty amazing. While I don't have Dark Horse Presents number 1, I just kind of wanted to briefly touch upon Dark Horse. Dark Horse has managed to stay in business for a very long time, despite all the ups and downs in the industry. So I thought this title was worth mentioning. This is kind of like their showcase title. And number 1 featured, I'll kind of show it on the side over here, Black Cross. But Dark Horse Presents came out in '86, and that was their first title. This was also a time of a lot of independent publishers. One was Blackthorn Publishing, and they published a number of different titles. This is a copy of Roachmill number 1. Maybe one of their better titles, but to be honest, I haven't read all of their other comic books, but I really like the negative space in this cover. But yeah, Roachmill, a curious independent title from the 1980s. This one is a bit of a cheat because the first issue of Shatter came out in 1985. It's actually dated December 1985. And number 2 came out in 1986. Actually, there was an issue before. I think it was like a one-shot. I'll show it over here. But this was the first computerized drawn comic book. And you can notice all the pixels there. The first few issues, I thought the art was really pretty good, but then it kind of went south kind of fairly quickly. But I thought these were worth mentioning because they're, quite an interesting comic book for that period of time. As I mentioned, this was the time of independence, and Comico was one of the better publishers. They're better known for titles like Mage and The Elementals, but this is the first issue of Johnny Quest. And I loved the cartoon growing up. It's like one of my favorite cartoons from that era. Fantagraphic Books published Critters. This is the second issue, not the first issue, but this also came out in 1986. And the first issue featured Usagi Yojimbo. And Usagi Yojimbo would appear in later issues, but I thought this was kind of an interesting anamorphic title that came out from Fantagraphic Books. I'm showing another different publisher here, and that's Capital Comics, and this is the first issue of Whisper, like a female ninja character. You know, I came across this book maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, and I've always kind of wanted to have the first issue, but it was always kind of tough to locate, so I was happy to find that. And this is an issue of Stark Future #1, published by Aircell, which I think became like Malibu shortly after. Aircell was well known for its two other like popular titles, which is Samurai and Elflord before this, and would also publish stuff like Warlock 5. But these black and white comics were super hot at one time, and literally after a year, they just kind of went all down the toilet. You know, it's funny. The cover price of these were pretty high for that period of time compared to like Marvel and DC, but a lot of people were buying these, were eating these up. One underrated title from the '86 that came out is the Nam, and I'm showing the first print, which is this guy over here, and the second print over there that has nicer colors. But Michael Golden and company did a really great run. And this was also during a period of time where the Vietnam War was kind of going through this media renaissance. And the Nam really captured the war very well. And the timing of the issues also coincided with the monthly events during the war. But definitely a title worth checking out. I've mentioned this series before in another one of my videos, and that's Squadron Supreme. And Squadron Supreme wrapped up in 1986, Mark Gruenwald's masterpiece. I highly recommend that you search it out and read it. And as I mentioned, I've talked about this in more than one of my previous episodes. An interesting title to come out of Marvel in '86, that's Strike Force Morituri. I just kind of wanted to show it because it's an interesting kind of offbeat title from Marvel, unusual from its time. X Factor was possibly the biggest title to come out of Marvel from 1986 in terms of anticipation. This is the first issue, and it's the original X-Men teaming up again to as a new team called X Factor. And you know, a few issues later, they would also introduce major villains like Apocalypse. But the first issue came out in 1986. I've talked a bit about this series in a few of my other previous episodes. Volume 1 came out in 1986. Volume 2 came out, I believe, in 91. And this is the only comic book to ever win a special Pulitzer Prize. And this is Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And it's a black and white kind of biography of his dad, Vladik. And it's probably one of the most important comic books ever written to come out of North America. And it's a heavy read. But again, like this came out in 1986, this insane year where we had all these significant comic books that made a big how would you say, had a lot of influence going forward in the industry. But certainly this is definitely worth checking out. And that's Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Dark Knight, Watchmen, Born Again, Mouse, you know, Crisis, Superman, The Man of Tomorrow, Superman, The Man of Steel. The list of iconic comic books that came out of this year is just staggering. You know, if you haven't had a chance to read any of these, I highly recommend them. And if you have, they are certainly worth revisiting every now and then because they're just that great. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out another one of my videos over here or over here. Until next time, read and enjoy your comic books.